She was meant to be background noise. In a room that ran on secrets and imported whisky, Calla Renfrew's only job was to ensure the ice bucket stayed full, the crystal stayed spotless, and she herself stayed invisible. But when her earpiece crackled with a vendor crisis and 3 years of suppressed fury came boiling up at once, she answered the phone in rapid, rolling Ukrainian, the language of her grandmother's kitchen, of Sunday borscht and old country curses she'd absorbed before she could read. She didn't know the most dangerous man in the room had spent 5 years doing business in Kyiv. She didn't know he'd understood every single word. And she certainly didn't know that 90 minutes later, in the underground parking garage of the Pembroke Club, she would hear 4 words spoken from the shadows that would alter the entire course of her life. She doesn't leave Mykola. The Pembroke Club occupied the top 2 floors of a converted heritage building on Hazelton Avenue, in the part of Toronto's Yorkville neighborhood, where the coffee cost $14 and the doorman remembered your name, but never your face. It was a private members club for the kind of people who didn't need to announce themselves, politicians, Bay Street lawyers, old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings rather than on social media. The decor was deliberate and sober. Walnut paneling, leather club chairs the color of tobacco, low amber lighting that softened every edge. It smelled of cedar and restraint. Calla Renfrew stood at the far end of the private dining suite known as the Cedar Room, a linen service cloth folded precisely over her left forearm. At 31, she was the Pembroke's senior event coordinator, a title she had carved out through 5 years of relentless, exhausting competence. She knew every server's schedule, every supplier's mobile number, every guest's dietary restriction and personal vanity. She had once rerouted an entire floral delivery during a February ice storm on the 401 and still had the table centerpieces assembled by 6:15. Nobody at the Pembroke questioned her abilities. Nobody, really, saw her at all. Calla was a plus-size woman in an industry that curated its visible staff the way it curated its wine list. She had wide shoulders, full arms, a soft stomach and rounded hips that her tailored black blazer and wide-leg trousers could accommodate but not erase. She took up space. The Pembroke kept her in the back offices more often than not, orchestrating from behind the scenes, and she had made a kind of peace with that, or at least a truce. Tonight, though, the regular head of floor operations was home with a fractured wrist, and Calla had been called in. The request had come from the general manager, David Fair, who had pulled her aside in the corridor with a clammy handshake and eyes that kept sliding toward the door. "The gentleman in the Cedar Room," Fair had said, keeping his voice just above a murmur, "is Mr. Gabriel Esposito. He has a standing reservation here, and he expects absolute privacy. You don't speak to him directly. You don't make eye contact. Whatever you hear in that room, Calla, it stays in that room." She had nodded, professionally, and she had gone in. Gabriel Esposito sat at the head of the long walnut table, as though it had been built around him. He was somewhere north of 40, broad-shouldered, and unhurried in the way that only truly dangerous men were unhurried. His dark hair was cut close at the sides and left longer on top, touched at the temples with early grey. He wore a navy suit that had clearly cost more than Calla's monthly rent in the annex, and his hands, large, scarred in a way that didn't fit with real estate or finance, rested perfectly still around a glass of scotch he hadn't yet touched. He hadn't looked at Calla once. She was furniture. There were 4 other men at the table. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Taras, whose collar was already damp despite the Cedar Room's deliberate chill, was the one doing most of the talking. He was explaining something in a low, urgent voice. Across from him, a lean, sharp-faced man named Mykola simply watched Taras with the patient, unamused expression of someone calculating the cost of cleaning a floor. Calla stood in the service alcove and looked at the painting on the opposite wall, a Georgian Bay landscape, that particular blue-grey water that always made her think of her grandmother's description of crossing the Atlantic. She checked her watch. 9:58. 1 more hour, and she could hand the overnight keys to the porter and take the subway home to her apartment on Brunswick. She was counting the minutes when they switched languages. It happened without ceremony. Gabriel had been listening to Taras with a stillness that was almost mechanical. Then he set his glass down very gently and spoke. Not in English, not in the standard Italian she might have expected from a name like Esposito. He spoke in Ukrainian, not the clipped, formal Ukrainian she sometimes heard on the news during the war coverage, but something older and more regional. A Poltava cadence she recognized the way she recognized the smell of dill and rendered fat on a Sunday afternoon. Mikola Vinzheznav pro Peradachu, he already knew about the handoff. The blood in Calla's ears went very quiet. Her grandmother, Baba Halina, had come to Canada in 1979 with $40 and a headscarf and a stubbornness that could bend rebar. She had settled in Etobicoke, refused to learn more English than she strictly needed, and raised Calla's mother in a household where Ukrainian was spoken at every meal, every holiday, in every argument. When Calla was small and her parents worked long shifts at the printing plant in Mississauga, she had spent her after-school hours in Baba Halina's apartment on Runnymede, helping roll vareniki and listening to her grandmother narrate the world in that exact dialect. Calla had grown up bilingual without ever really choosing it, the way you grow up knowing a smell or a season. She knew precisely what Gabriel had just said, and she knew what Michaela said next. The shipment cleared at Pearson 3 days ago, but the money didn't reach the account. Taras authorized the transfer himself because she had grown up hearing words like those in Ukrainian folktales where men who stole from the wrong people ended up at the bottom of a lake. These men were not telling a folktale. Calla stared at the Georgian Bay painting with every muscle locked into absolute stillness. Her lungs continued to function, barely on biological autopilot. "You are part of the wall," she told herself. "You are the painting, you are the cedar paneling. You do not understand a single word." Taras began to sweat harder. And then Calla's earpiece buzzed. It was the override channel, the one that only activated for catastrophic logistics failures. She felt it before she heard it, a sharp pulse against her ear canal. Tomorrow evening, the Pembroke was hosting the annual gala for the Lakeshore Children's Foundation. 400 guests, a 12-course tasting menu, a live auction. Calla was lead coordinator. She had spent 7 months sourcing everything down to the hand-poured beeswax taper candles. At the table, Gabriel had glanced toward her. She met his eyes for the half-second she couldn't avoid, then looked back at the painting. "I need to step out to address her," she began. "Stay," Gabriel's voice was even. "Handle it here quietly." She pressed herself as far into the service alcove as the dimensions allowed, turned her back to the table, and answered. Renfrew, her voice was a whisper. What came through the speaker was not quiet. The voice belonged to Bohdan Prichina, a wholesale seafood importer out of Etobicoke, who supplied the Pembroke's shellfish. He was one of those men who treated every negotiation as a personal insult. He was only reluctantly surviving. "Mrs. Renfrew," the H in her name landed like a door slam. "I'm calling to tell you the lobster is not coming tomorrow. The cold storage unit, she has a mechanical problem. Very serious, very expensive. For the repair cost, the club must wire me an additional $15,000 tonight, or there is no delivery." Calla closed her eyes. She had a signed contract. She had a deposit receipt. She had 400 guests and a foundation auction and a donor list that included the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and Bohdan Prichina was extorting her at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. "Mr. Prichina," she whispered, "we have a signed agreement. You cannot amend the terms 12 hours before. The trucks don't move without the money. Have a good evening." Something in the back of Calla's chest snapped clean in two. She had been invisible her whole career. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and shuffled into back offices while less competent people collected the credit for her work. She had stood in this alcove for the past hour, listening to men plan something she was fairly certain involved a great deal of lake water. She had held her composure with both hands. She had sore feet and a support undergarment leaving marks on her ribcage, and a cold threatening to become something worse. She was done. Before Boden Prichina could hang up, Calla switched languages. Sluche men Bodane. Her voice dropped an octave. The Ukrainian rolled out of her mouth in the exact key of her grandmother's kitchen table. Flat, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who has decided she is finished being polite. Tai dumayesh cho mozesh rati zimenoyu. The contract is signed. If those trucks are not at the loading dock by 7 tomorrow morning, I will make your life so complicated, you will wish you only had a broken freezer to worry about. Did I make myself clear? A very long silence. Then, Calla Renfrew. Tomorrow, 7, full order, no extra charges. She ended the call. The cedar room was silent. Not quiet in the normal way of a private dining room at the end of a conversation. Silent in the way of a room where everyone has stopped moving at once. Calla turned around. Gabriel Esposito was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was sitting straight, one forearm braced against the edge of the walnut table, and his dark eyes were fixed on her with an attention that felt physical, like a hand closing around something it intended to keep. Mycola's expression had shifted from blank patience to something sharper and harder to name. Even Taras had stopped sweating in order to stare. Gabriel's gaze was unhurried and absolute. He wasn't looking past her. He wasn't looking at the soft width of her hips or the roundness of her arms with the dismissal she'd accumulated a lifetime of recognizing. He was looking at her face, at her eyes, like she was something he hadn't expected to find here, and now that he had no intention of losing track of it. "Is the catering crisis resolved, Miss Renfrew?" Gabriel asked in English, in a voice like the low register of a pipe organ. "Yes, sir," Calla said, her voice held, barely. "Everything is under control." He watched her for 4 long seconds. "I can see that," he said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Though it didn't quite reach a smile, he nodded once toward the door. "We're finished for the evening, gentlemen. The room is needed." Calla moved to begin the clearing process, grateful for the physical task. Napkins, glassware, the small choreography of service that let her keep her eyes on her hands, and her breathing on a tight leash. Gabriel rose, buttoned his jacket, and at the doorway paused. "Good night, Miss Renfrew," he said without turning back. She was in the staff locker room 6 minutes later, hands shaking so hard she could barely work the combination lock. When the door finally swung open, she stripped off her blazer, swapped her stiff trousers for the black leggings she kept in her bag for late nights, and pulled on the oversized fisherman's knit sweater that lived in her locker from October to April. She stared at herself in the mirror. "You are fine," she told her reflection. "You are a hotel events coordinator. They are businessmen. They won't hurt a civilian over a phone call in Ukrainian, because that would be insane, and also because you don't actually know anything." But she did know something. She knew the words "shipment, Pearson, 3 days ago," and "money didn't reach the account." She knew a man named Taras was in a great deal of trouble. She knew enough to be a problem. Calla grabbed her tote bag, wound her scarf twice around her neck against the February cold, and walked fast toward the staff exit. The underground garage beneath the Pembroke smelled of old concrete and recycled heat. Her Toyota Corolla was on P2, near the elevator bank, a sensible, salt-scarred car with a cracked sun visor and a dashcam her mother had insisted on. She was 10 feet from the driver's door when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't run. She walked faster instead, hand already reaching for her keys, thumb finding the unlock button. The headlights flashed cheerfully in the gloom. A hand, large, leather-gloved, landed flat on the driver's window and held the door shut. Calla spun back, pressing herself against the cold metal, keys biting into her palm. Mycola stood in front of her. Behind him, a second man she didn't recognize had appeared from between tar-parked SUVs. They hadn't touched her, they hadn't needed to. The parking garage at 10:45 at night was doing most of the work for them. "You're leaving very quickly, Miss Renfrew," Mykola said. He had a light accent and the delivery of someone who had never needed to raise his voice. My shift ended. She kept her chin level and her shoulders back. She was not a small woman, and she had learned a long time ago that the only people who noticed that in her favor were the ones who bothered to look. "Please move away from my car. I'm afraid there's been a slight extension to your shift." "She's not going to run, Mykola." The voice came from behind both of them, from the shadows beyond the flickering fluorescent overhead light. A maintenance ticket Calla herself had submitted 3 weeks ago. Gabriel Esposito walked forward into the pale, unsteady glow. He had removed his jacket. In his dress shirt and waistcoat, the fabric pulling across his shoulders, he looked less like a Bay Street client, and more like what the security briefing had suggested he actually was. His eyes in the flat concrete light were a very dark brown, and they were calm in the particular way of people who have not been surprised in a very long time. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she had to make a deliberate choice not to step back. "Mr. Esposito," Calla said, "I want to be clear with you. Whatever I may have overheard tonight, I don't know what it means, and I have absolutely no interest in making it my business. I just want to go home." "You're an honest liar," Gabriel said, "and a very bad one." "Your grandmother was from Poltava. It wasn't a question." Calla's stomach dropped. "Mine was from a village outside Lubny," he continued. "She used to say the exact phrase you used with your supplier, word for word, the intonation and everything." He paused. "It's not something you pick up from a language app." "She raised me," Calla said. Her voice had gone quiet and flat. "That's all. I'm just a woman from Etobicoke trying to keep her job." "You're a woman who heard me discuss the disposition of a disloyal associate," Gabriel said pleasantly, as if they were discussing table arrangements. "That makes your situation somewhat more complicated than a shift change." Calla squared her shoulders and looked up at him. He had several inches on her, but she was not a woman who had ever had the luxury of forgetting she took up space, so she used every centimeter of herself. "I won't say anything. I give you my word." Gabriel's expression shifted. Not into warmth exactly, into interest. He reached out slowly and Calla braced herself, but he didn't grab her. He tucked a loose strand of hair back from the side of her face, the way someone does when the gesture is too familiar and also completely inevitable. His hand was warm against the garage cold, and the contrast was startling. "I believe you," he said. "That's not actually the problem." "Then what is?" "The problem," Gabriel said, "is that I watched you stand in a room full of men who would have made most people cry, and you held that linen cloth on your arm for an hour with your breathing perfectly controlled. And then you took a phone call and I heard you speak Ukrainian the way my grandmother scolded her chickens, like you were born to give orders, and the universe had simply failed to catch up." He paused. "I haven't been genuinely surprised by another person in approximately 4 years, and I am not prepared to let that walk to the subway." Calla stared at him. "That is possibly the most alarming compliment I've ever received." Something that was almost a laugh moved through him, quickly suppressed. He looked at Mykola. "Bring the car around." "No," Calla said sharply. "Absolutely not. I have a foundation gala tomorrow evening. I have 400 guests, 12 courses, and a live auction with a reserve of $2.3 million. And if I'm not there from 7 a.m. to manage load-in, this club and everyone associated with it will be on the front page of the Star for the wrong reasons. You cannot put me in a car." Gabriel regarded her. "You just declined a direct instruction from me." "I just told you about a logistical reality." She crossed her arms over her chest. "You seem like a man who deals in logistical realities." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then, "Get in the car, Miss Renfrew. I'll have you back by 6:30. She got in the car, mostly because the alternative was worse, and partly because something in his tone had shifted, from command to something closer to negotiation, and she'd been in enough negotiations to know when the other side had moved. The SUV was black and warm, and smelled of wood smoke, and something's expense Makola rode up front. Gabriel sat beside her in the back, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to make the available space feel considered. They crossed Bloor Street, heading north, the city glittering through the tinted glass. February in Toronto was a particular shade of orange-grey at night, the street lights bouncing off the snowpack in the gutters. Taras said the shipment cleared Pearson, Calla said, before she'd fully decided to say it. Gabriel turned his head. 3 days ago. That's what Makola said. She kept her eyes on the city outside the window, her brain, which had an unfortunate tendency to keep working even when the rest of her was terrified, had been doing some since she'd walked out of the Cedar Room. But I track every external vendor delivery for the Pembroke. Anything that comes through the loading dock, I have the manifest. 3 days ago, we had a large art installation delivered for the Foundation Gala, 12 crates, supposedly from a Brussels gallery, but the paperwork was from a freight forwarder in Mississauga. She glanced at him. Same address as the Prichina cold storage facility, the one that supposedly has a broken freezer tonight. The interior of the SUV was very quiet. Taras didn't lose your money, Calla said. He hid it in art shipping crates currently sitting in the Pembroke's loading dock, scheduled to be opened tomorrow morning when the gala setup crew starts work. Gabriel was looking at her now in a way that made the back of her neck warm. You worked that out from a phone call and a manifest database, he said. I work from manifest databases every day of my life. Makola, Gabriel said, and his voice had gone very level, very controlled. I heard, Makola said from the front seat. If I try to access those crates tonight, Gabriel said, almost to himself, and the dock cameras show anything unusual, it ends up somewhere it shouldn't. You can't access them tonight, Calla agreed, with the calm of someone who has just realized she has leverage. But I can. Tomorrow morning. During setup, I can open every crate in that loading dock with a perfectly legitimate reason in front of my own staff. While the security cameras show exactly what they're supposed to show, an event coordinator checking an art installation for condition. She paused. If you let me go to my gala. Gabriel said nothing for several seconds. You are either very brave or very foolish, he said at last. I coordinate 400-person events for a living, Calla said. There's not a lot of daylight between the two. The quiet stretched. Then, Makola, take us to Rosedale. He looked at Calla. You'll stay the night. Taras has people and he knows you were in that room. I need a change of clothes. Someone will collect them. And I need my coordinator binder. It's in a tote on the passenger seat of my Corolla. He almost smiled. We'll get the binder, Miss Renfrew. Calla, she said without thinking. If I'm apparently spending the night at the home of a man who might have me disappeared, we're probably past surnames. Gabriel, he said, and this time the corner of his mouth actually moved. The Pembroke's loading dock at 7:15 the next morning was the controlled chaos that Calla lived for. She had her headset on, her coordinator binder under one arm, and a keep cup of coffee she'd found in Gabriel's kitchen, which had turned out to be enormous and staffed at 6 a.m. by a housekeeper named Mrs. Soluk, who had taken one look at Calla and immediately started pressing food on her. Gabriel stood against the dock wall with his jacket on and his arms folded, watching. Makola was behind him. Neither of them looked like they belonged at a gala setup. Both of them seemed to be managing fine. The hydrangeas go directly upstairs, Calla told the florist's delivery crew, not breaking stride. Do not stage them in the cold. Last time someone staged them in the cold we had drooping by 7 p.m. and I will not have drooping. She turned to the setup coordinator. Where are we on the auction display tables? On track. The podium lighting? Tech crew's up there now. Good. She turned to the row of wooden crates stacked against the far wall. 12 of them, each stamped with the logo of a Brussels gallery that she had confirmed at 2 in the morning using Gabriel's laptop and a very strong cup of tea, did not have a registered address in Belgium. I need to inspect the art installation before it goes upstairs. Condition report for the Foundation's insurance rider. Her assistant, Jamie, handed her a clipboard without question. Calla walked to the first crate, snapped the clasps, and lifted the lid. Foam padding. A framed landscape print, unremarkable. Second crate, same. Third crate. She lifted the edge of the foam insert and her fingers found something that had no business being in a gallery crate, the edge of a vacuum-sealed brick. She lowered the foam, re-latched the lid, and turned to Jamie with the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent years managing catastrophes without letting her face say so. These 3 at the back need to go to secure storage, not upstairs. The mounting hardware doesn't match the wall fixtures in the ballroom. Can you have them moved? Sure thing, Jamie said, making a note. Calla turned and met Gabriel's eyes across the loading dock. He nodded once, and she felt the slow, careful release of something in her chest. She was standing at the ballroom entrance at 9:45 that evening, watching 400 people move through the room like a very well-dressed tide, when her eye caught what her brain had been trained to catch. 2 men who didn't belong. They were in catering whites that were too new, too stiff. Their shoes were wrong, tactical soles, not kitchen clogs. They were moving through the room with a vector, not a drift, and they were both looking at the north side of the ballroom where Gabriel stood at the edge of the crowd with a glass of sparkling water, watching Calla work. She understood in a single cold second that Taras had known Gabriel would come to the gala, that Taras had used the crates to bait a location, that the men in the white jackets were not here for the lobster bisque. She touched her earpiece. Security, north service entrance. Static. A guest had fallen near the bar. She could hear it through the channel, the security team redirecting. Classic misdirection. The first man was 15 feet from Gabriel. His right hand was moving under his tray. Calla did not think, she moved. She was not a small woman, and she was not a slow one, and she had spent 5 years navigating crowded event spaces at speed, which meant she knew exactly how to use her body's mass and momentum as a tool rather than a liability. She crossed the ballroom floor in 8 strides and hit the first man from the left side, driving her shoulder into his ribs with everything she weighed. He grunted and stumbled. And then they were both going sideways into the champagne tower that had been Calla's quiet pride since she'd sourced the glassware personally, and the sound of 200 glasses meeting the parquet floor was like a chandelier falling. The room screamed. The music stopped. Gabriel spun. His eyes found her on the floor, tangled with a man in catering whites, champagne soaking through her blazer. He saw the gun that had slid across the parquet. He saw the second man raising his weapon. What happened next was very fast and very quiet. Calla was mostly occupied trying to keep the first man from getting up. She caught a grip on his wrist, felt the hard crack of her palm against the floor, felt something warm on her hand from the broken glass beneath her. Then the weight on her was gone. Gabriel had crossed the room. The second man was against the wall, and Mykola was there from somewhere with 2 other men, and it was over in less time than it took to pour a glass of wine. Gabriel came to where she was sitting on the wet floor, amid shattered crystal and spilled champagne, her blazer soaked through, her hand bleeding from a cut on her palm. He crouched in front of her. His face was different. The composure was still there, but something underneath it had cracked open. His hands, when he reached for her, were not steady. Calla. Her name in his mouth sounded nothing like the way anyone else said it. Lower, rougher. Look at me. She looked at him. You ran at a man with a gun, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. You weren't looking, she said. He let out a breath that had been held too long, and then his hands cupped her face, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and stayed there for a moment, not speaking, just breathing. Behind them, Mykola was speaking quietly into a phone. Around them, Gabriel's people moved through the crowd with smooth, purposeful efficiency, directing guests toward the outer rooms, explaining that there had been a champagne tower accident, suggesting they move to the lounge for a complimentary digestif while the ballroom was refreshed. The lobster bisque was excellent, by the way, Calla said, because her mouth was still running on event coordinator autopilot and she had no idea how to stop it. Gabriel made a sound that was almost a laugh, a real one, sudden and startled, the most human thing she'd heard from him. He pulled back to look at her, his thumb moving carefully over the cut on her palm, and the expression on his face was the one she would think about later, a man who had not expected to find something precious, and was now confronted with the terror of having almost lost it. "We need to leave," he said. "The gala." "Jamie has it." He helped her to her feet, his hand steady under her elbow. "I called him. He's been promoted." "You can't just promote my assistant." "I also donated $300,000 to the foundation's auction reserve." He guided her toward the service exit, one arm around her back. "Your gala is saved. Let's go." The Rosedale penthouse was very quiet at midnight. The city below was a grid of amber light, Lake Ontario a dark seam at the edge of everything. Calla stood in the center of the living room in her damp, champagne-stiff clothes, a clean bandage on her palm, and felt the adrenaline finally let go of her in one long exhale. Gabriel handed her a glass of water and a neatly folded sweater, cashmere, charcoal gray, that she recognized as his own. "You don't have to do that," she said. "You're shivering," he said. "Change." She did in the bathroom, and when she came back, the sweater was enormous on her, and she didn't care. Gabriel was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at the city. When he heard her, he turned. He crossed the room slowly, and she stayed where she was, and he stopped close to her with his hands at his sides like a man exercising considerable restraint. "I have spent 3 years running a business that requires me to trust exactly no one," Gabriel said. "And in the last 18 hours I watched a woman I met over an ice bucket read my associate's financial crimes from a catering manifest, negotiate 200 kilos of stolen cash back into my possession using a seafood delivery as cover, and then physically throw herself between me and a man with a weapon." He paused. "Because I wasn't looking." "You were," Calla said, "just in the wrong direction." "Yes," he said, "I was." His hands came up to frame her face, tilting it toward his with the careful deliberation of someone trying hard not to move too fast. "I don't want someone who fades into service alcoves and tells me only what I want to hear. I've had enough of that to last 2 lifetimes." "I don't know how to do that anyway," Calla said. "I know." His thumb traced her cheekbone, slow and careful. "The way you handle something you don't want to break. Society tells women built like you to make themselves smaller, to take up less space, to stay in the back offices and be grateful for the overtime." His voice had gone low and rough. "You've been doing the opposite your entire life, and it is, without question, the most remarkable thing I have ever watched." Calla had spent her whole career being the woman behind the scenes, the one who made things happen invisibly, who was indispensable and overlooked. She had built armor out of competence and learned to wear her invisibility like a uniform. She had never expected someone to look at her the way Gabriel was looking at her now, like she was the whole room, not the furniture in it. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, "with any of this." "You're the sharpest logistical mind I've ever encountered," Gabriel said. "You speak Poltava Ukrainian with the fire of someone's grandmother. You stood in a room full of men who terrify most people I know for an hour, without blinking. And then tonight, you used your own body as a shield for mine." He paused. "You know exactly what you're doing, Calla. You've always known. The world just never got around to telling you." He kissed her then, careful at first, and then not careful at all, his arms wrapping around the full, soft weight of her, as though he'd been looking for something to hold on to and had finally, unexpectedly, found it. Outside, the February city glittered on the other side of the floor-to-ceiling glass, cold and indifferent and enormous. Lake Ontario sat at the edge of the skyline like a sleeping thing. Calla Renfrew had spent her career making herself invisible so she wouldn't be dismissed. She had made herself small so she wouldn't be a target. She had hidden her grandmother's language in the back of her throat like a secret she was ashamed of. Tonight she had used all of it, every centimeter, every syllable, every logistical instinct she'd ever sharpened in a back office while someone else took the credit, to dismantle a conspiracy, recover stolen money, and save the life of the most dangerous man in the room. Baba Halina would have approved. The city spread out below them, glittering and vast, and Calla let herself take up every inch of the space she had always deserved.